All right, everybody. We are moving on down to the last bit for the year, so I think we get a little appropriate road there on a little linksy area, which I think is kind of nice and representative of how far we've come this year. But in any event, here we are starting kind of the last unit of the year. I am going to be putting notes up in more depth for all four of these chapters, even though in class we're going to be covering them a little bit less, and I'll get kind of more of the essential stuff to you in class, especially as we begin a review here for the AP exam. But anyway, don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe to my channel for many great offers, exclusive content, and chances to win great stuff like fives on your AP exam. So today we're going to talk a little bit about some of the background of the 1960s, at least more specifically with the presidency of JFK and Lyndon Johnson, as well as a little bit on the civil rights movement. It'll be a 3-day, three videos, just like with everything else, and that'll be that. So it's hard to believe we're already here to chapter 29, and let's go ahead and get right to it. All right. So let's clarify a couple things first here. This is not JFK. We should already know that. That's President Lyndon Johnson. First thing I want to talk about is a little bit about JFK's legacy as president. One of the things you might find interesting is we don't spend a ton of time talking about JFK here, but we'll get the major stuff in here now regarding his presidency, because a lot of what he wanted to do was done by Lyndon Johnson. But nevertheless, JFK does have a significant legacy to us as a president. I think probably somewhat because, he was young and, he was killed, obviously, in office, and it just makes it so, like so much of life unfulfilled or uncompleted that I think people really kind of look at Kennedy really with rosy colored glasses because of that. So Kennedy's whole objective as president was something he called the New Frontier, which include basically all of his goals as president, which included things like putting a man on the moon, going to space, the final frontier, the new frontier, doing more stuff with space, pulling further ahead of the Soviet Union in regards to the Cold War. The Cold War is still growing strong in the 1960s, so that is, obviously a big concern of Kennedy's, as well as his domestic agenda, which would largely be fulfilled in Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, which we'll talk about here shortly. But Kennedy's presidency as a whole had some great successes and had some drawbacks as well. Obviously, one of the big drawbacks has to do with Cuba and the Bay of Pigs invasion, which turned out to be kind of a big, kind of like a big misstep. We had sent some folks over to Cuba to try to assassinate basically Fidel Castro because Cuba had fallen to the Soviet Union in 1959. The idea of having Cuba as a communist country, so physically close to the United States, is very much not good for the Cold War and for us or for containment. So this Bay of Pigs thing turned into a big fiasco and failure. However, to make up for that, Kennedy successfully navigates and wins, so to speak, something called the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, in 1962, the CIA got wind that there were all these nuclear missiles that were making their way over to Cuba because surveillance suggested that they were there. This, of course, makes us very concerned because the Cubans, or the Soviets, were putting missiles in Cuba that they could send over relatively quickly and blow up and destroy American cities. Kind of the same thing we could do to Soviet cities from Turkey. Okay, it turned into a big standoff between Kennedy and the leader of the Soviet Union, a guy by the name of Nikita Khrushchev. Oops. Yeah, you can't even read that. Nikita Khrushchev. Let's try again. All right. Anyway, so Kennedy and Khrushchev go back and forth for a while. Neither one wants to back down. Ultimately, Khrushchev backs down, and the United States gets a big win in regards to the Cold War. So this kind of turns the table of the Cold War a little bit, as things have been going kind of bad for the United States. The Soviets got into space before we did. They had erected the Berlin Wall. So things weren't looking as good. The whole Bay of Pigs thing didn't reflect very well upon us. The conflict in Korea hadn't gone as good as we hoped, even though it was still containment. This helps change things. And even though Kennedy is a Democrat, Kennedy is very much a containment guy. He is very much a supporter of containment policy. He's very much anti-communism, as you have to be if you want to be president of the United States in the world of the Cold War. So don't be misguided by anything to say that Kennedy was any less of a containment guy than his predecessors. He was just as much as Eisenhower, just as much as Truman, and just as much as that saint god of a man Ronald Wilson Reagan would be come the 1980s. Okay, so that's a big part of JFK's legacy that I think is important to note. The other thing that I think makes JFK very, very popular is the fact that he really is the personification of the ideal of the nuclear family. He's the same age, his coming of age is the same age as a lot of these parents of that time, these parents who have these baby boomer children. He fought in World War II, right? He was young, attractive, with a beautiful wife and these small children. And it really allowed the American people to identify with the President of the United States on a level that they hadn't been able to for a long time, because a lot of young Americans and Americans in general with families saw in themselves a lot of what JFK was. And so that really helped to kind of up his legacy in the minds of a lot of people. And then the third thing probably that and this would be the case for any great president, is Kennedy was a very passionate speaker whose words really helped inspire pride amongst the American people. So you've got this Cold Warrior mentality and great success with the Cuban Missile Crisis. You've got this personification of the nuclear family through his being young with young children, and at that stage in life that presidents hadn't been at in a while, and being this impassioned speaker. I think all aid to the legacy of JFK, and the fact that it all kind of came crashing down that day in Dallas when Lee Harvey Oswald came up and assassinated President Kennedy in the motorcade, and brought Lyndon Johnson to the presidency. So from there, we'll move on. Okay, so LBJ, or Lyndon Johnson, is a very interesting figure as president. In many ways, very successful and very innovative in doing a lot of things he did. In some ways, some of his programs, which came to be known as the Great Society, were carried on by the New Frontier programs of JFK. Largely the ones that dealt with kind of domestic issues and domestic change. Okay? The Great Society programs of Lyndon Johnson, first thing to understand, this is the biggest federal government money commitment since the New Deal. In fact, the Great Society would cost America more money than Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal cost America. Okay, so the Great Society is tremendously expensive as a series of programs, but it does a lot of different things and a lot of things that are still around today that you probably are familiar with but don't realize they come from this time. Now, Johnson is committed to these efforts because he had spent time before he got into politics, he was a teacher in like Southwest Texas and witnessed the extreme poverty and difficult circumstances that a lot of his students and their families, were dealing with, particularly ones that were coming up from Mexico. And this made him very passionate about supporting these programs that he called his Great Society. And the Great Society deals with a lot of things: civil rights, poverty, education, urban renewal, lots of different stuff. Okay. Obviously, one of the biggest problems that the American people have become more familiar with in years around the 1960s here is issues of poverty. And one of the first things, or the main thing, that the Great Society seeks to address is the problem of poverty in the United States. That rather than leaving people on their own, the federal government needs to intervene and do something to help people, in conditions and positions of poverty. Now, obviously, this is something that still today, more than 50 years later, still today is a divisive topic politically. People should help themselves. People need more help to be able to get ahead, and there's all kinds of differing opinions on that. But the Great Society does a lot in regards to addressing the needs of the impoverished in America. Let's look at what specifically. One thing that it pursues is major healthcare initiatives, particularly Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare, of course, is medical aid for the elderly and retired. Medicaid, of course, is medical aid for the poor or people that are unable to work. So basically, we get the establishment of Medicare and Medicaid. And this is America's kind of first major healthcare system to really ever be established. Okay. That spends billions of dollars every year giving aid to people, at least to some degree, for medical coverage, for health purposes, for things like that. Obviously, Medicare and Medicaid are things that still today develop and create political disagreement and controversy. Johnson also addresses education, immigration, and urban poverty in these programs as well. Okay, first of all, let's take a look at how Johnson addresses education. Okay, for one, we see again lots of money be doled out to various programs to help better education opportunities for impoverished kids. You've got underfunded schools, underfunded public education. Johnson has to convince Congress that it's important to have the federal government provide more money to ensure that educational opportunities are fair and equitable for all people. And this is one of the ways that he does this through this Great Society program, putting more than like $1 billion initially into helping provide more funding to urban public schools, providing opportunity to, again, have people in urban areas have better, have better opportunities for more education, have better access to learning and education. One important thing that gets established here that's still around today is the Head Start program, which is basically a program for to help literacy programs for poor students in poor communities who have often come from like single parent homes and stuff like that. If the mom has to work, it's kind of like a daycare type program, but um, it helps try to get kids that are at a kind of disadvantage educationally to kind of equal footing with um, typical students once by the time they get to school. So, reading programs, literacy programs, and stuff of that nature. Also, taking the first steps in helping make college more affordable to average students, or more of a possibility for average students, is something else created through some of these federal aid to education programs. Another thing that we see created is something called the Model Cities program. Okay, for one, we see the Housing Act, which ensures that affordable housing is available to people that have lesser financial means. This ultimately, sadly, kind of is what results in things like projects, affordable housing, or like Section 8 housing, that are kind of like homes that are the where the cost is kind of regimented to whatever people can afford to pay. So we see that created, which again helps with homelessness and make housing more affordable to people. But obviously, certainly, living conditions and projects in Section 8 housing aren't always most desirable. Furthermore, you have something called the Model City program. The Model City program was a system created to kind of help identify and educate minority urban leaders to kind of step up and kind of get training to become leaders within growingly diverse communities. Okay, if that makes any sense. The Model City program basically says, Lyndon Johnson and Congress at this time says, okay, obviously the urban areas are becoming more gentrified. Okay, in other words, urban areas are becoming more black or Latino or Asian or whatever population it might be. So let's try to identify, some impressive young people from these communities and, get them involved in politics so they can become the community leaders that the increasingly diverse community needs. It's a program that works pretty well, and over the course of 10 years, we start to see some big cities in America electing minority mayors, particularly black mayors, of their cities, and it's a better representation, or becomes a better representation of what the urban population of those cities might be. So the Model City program, in many ways, was successful. Immigration Act of 1965, really quick here, is also important. The Immigration Act of 1965 ends the National Ordinance Act of 1924. So that thing with the quotas, with the 2% of the population is all that can get in. The Immigration Act of 1965 ends that. There's no more quotas, limits essentially on how many people can get into, from a particular country, how many people can get into the United States in a particular year. So the quota system of immigration now has come to an end as a result of the Immigration Act of 1965. And that's a good thing. So, in summary, right, the Great Society has lots of positives. It has some drawbacks as well. Okay, positive achievements, of course, are the things that we see here. Model Cities program. The Immigration Act is a good thing. Reforms in education and the Head Start program, really addressing poverty for the first time in a long time. And the needs of people in poverty. Establishing, another thing they do is they establish new housing codes that provide affordable housing to people, so that's good. So lots of good comes from it. Now, what are the drawbacks? What are the other side of the Great Society? Well, For one, it's tremendously expensive and continues to be tremendously expensive to today. Um, Even more so than the New Deal. Okay, uh, incredibly increases the federal deficit. Does the Great Society programs, and they continue, like I said, to cost the country a lot of money today. Uh, Another drawback is it enhances the American welfare state. Okay, um, a lot of people would argue that with handouts, so to speak, through welfare payments or Section 8 housing or project living or something like that, Medicaid and things of that nature, um, that it kills food stamps, that it kills people's motivation to work to better themselves because they can depend instead on government handouts. So the expansion of the welfare state, some would argue, is another negative. Um, Another thing it does that people don't like is it took money away from some other government programs that people felt were important. Even though it increases the federal deficit, cuts have to be made somewhere. One of these places, is in some areas of defense, some areas of, you know, um, work opportunities or things of that nature. So we see some federal programs get cut, to pay for some of these plans. Uh, and it also leads to ultimately um, frustration, particularly amongst the middle class white population, that says, all these advantages and opportunities are being given to minorities. Um, where are opportunities? Where are chances to improve and grow? And for us to take the next step socially as well, that would be the argument that you'd get from, particularly from middle class whites too, that have some frustration from all this program, especially when affirmative action comes along later in the decade. Okay, so let's continue really quick here. Talk for a few minutes about some civil rights issues. That was a long time on that slide. Sorry. All right. So with the many successes that we see in the civil rights movement during the 1950s, Brown versus Board of Education, the Little Rock Nine, the Montgomery bus boycotts, the emergence of Dr. King, we're seeing the expansion of the civil rights movement, as a real vehicle for change coming into the 1960s. So we see the protests expand. And what needs to happen as these protest movements expand, of course, is you need to have you need to have good organization, right? Any protest movement is only as good as the organization behind it. Is it well organized? Is it set up well? Does it have specific goals? We see a lot of organizations pop up in the 1960s whose goals it is to establish opportunities for civil rights, right? So let's talk about a few of these. First, you have the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the SNCC, or SNCC as it was called. Basically, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was an organization of both black and white college-age students whose goal it was to, help kind of, I guess, disenfranchised African Americans in the South. They lead efforts to register blacks to vote, to desegregate lunch counters, things of that nature, right? It's SNCC that is going to go into and organize a lot of these sit-ins in places that are like white-only restaurants. Okay, so their goal is to, of course, improve African American, voting opportunities as well as desegregate lunch counters. That's what they're most noted for. Okay, you have the SCLC. Now, a lot of these groups have similar goals. The SCLC is important because its leader was Martin Luther King Jr. The SCLC stands for Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And it's still around today. This is probably the most powerful organization in the South in terms of its leadership and bringing attention to the needs of the civil rights movement. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, led by Martin Luther King Jr., helped organized bus boycotts and, kind of like the protest marches in cities like Selma, Alabama, that were protesting, the voting rights and obviously the violence that happened upon the protesters who did that. So they're going to be really influential and significant in pursuing a lot of these goals. Okay, um, especially because they got the leadership of people like Martin Luther King and Medgar Evers and other significant leaders of the civil rights movement. Another group you have is the Congress on Racial Equality, CORE. Now, CORE had actually been around since the 1940s. And they go a long way into helping organize what are known as the Freedom Rides, which were these, you get these people from the North, college students typically, and they would ride into the South into kind of some of these cities where, there weren't, where they didn't allow African Americans to vote, where Jim Crow laws were still prominent, and they would get, they would help in trying to register African Americans to vote. Now, this of course resulted in a lot of violence, as some of these buses would roll on into towns in Alabama and Mississippi, and angry mobs would greet them with, pitchforks and guns and violence, which was sadly, part of what all these groups had to deal with. But the key here, when you're talking about any of these groups, is they're organized groups. Okay, if you just get a group of people to go out and protest, you're not going to get long-term results. But we're seeing the successes of the civil rights movement here during the 1960s because you have very organized efforts to try to accomplish very similar goals. You're mobilizing students in the South. You're mobilizing leaders through the SCLC, right? You're mobilizing people from the North to come down South and help in this process to change things. This is why we're starting to see this stuff in the 1960s really start to result in some positive outcomes. Okay? The big summer of 1964 was the Freedom Summer, and these Freedom Riders, mostly from SNCC and CORE, would again go down into these southern cities and try to overturn Jim Crow and helping African Americans register to vote and take advantage of the right that's promised them in the Constitution. These groups really help make a national commitment out of the civil rights efforts of the early 1960s. Okay, it puts pressure on the federal government to act. It puts pressure on Congress to make laws to kind of change some of the things that are going. It's kind of the same stuff that we're seeing today with with the Black Lives Matter movement and George Floyd and all that stuff. Whether or not you agree with that is irrelevant here. But what I'm saying is that you start to see something happen. You get an organized movement together that wants to pursue a significant national change to better opportunity for people that are perceived to have less opportunity, and that's what the civil rights movements of the 60s are about, and that's kind of what some groups are pushing for today, though I don't know that the organization is as well tooled now as it was back in the 60s with groups like these. So, big acts, big movements, big things that come, okay? The biggest moment of the civil rights movement is no doubt August 28th, 1963, the March on Washington, where Martin Luther King gave his famous I Have a Dream speech, okay? To have a national stage like that, and essentially the support of the President of the United States, Kennedy was still there at the time, green lighting your ability to go there and have, in the headquarters of democracy for the world, have this great speech to, in a nonviolent way to outline, this is what we want to accomplish. This is what I want. That's again the power, the power of great speaking. Martin Luther King, JFK were able to convince people, whether they liked them or not. Like Martin Luther King was able to convince white people, that his goals were good. Just as JFK, as a Democrat, was able to convince a lot of Republicans that I'm okay because the goals that I have for this country are good for everyone, right? We don't have that sort of unification today, and I think it shows a lot in just the nature of things that we have. But the power of great speaking is very, very evident in Kennedy, and again, very, very evident in Martin Luther King, particularly in the I Have a Dream speech, maybe the most famous speech given by an American in the entirety of the 20th century, if not ever. The following year, now of course Johnson is president, and we get the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This again shows a national commitment to change in regards to the civil rights. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 bans discrimination in all public facilities, officially, in a national level. No more black only, white only, anything like that. Bans discrimination in all public facilities, which includes schools, parks, bans discrimination with employment. So you can't discriminate against somebody based on their race for employment opportunities. No more segregated schools as a national law. There shouldn't be no more desegregation because all schools should now be integrated. You go to the school that's convenient for you, that's nearby, whatever. Civil Rights Act of 1964 is a big moment. You get the Voting Rights Act of 1965. As a result, okay, I'm getting ahead of myself here, sorry. Okay, so in 1965, we get the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This comes as a result of pressure from these groups, as well as something that was known as the Freedom Summer, the summer of 1964, where college students from groups like CORE and the SNCC go into the South and really push to pursue voter registration for a lot of blacks in the South that are victimized by Jim Crow laws. Okay, that results in the upending of Jim Crow with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 bans literacy tests for voting, bans poll taxes, grandfather clauses, all that stuff. Basically kills Jim Crow. So it was in 1965, Jim Crow, from a legal perspective, is effectively dead in the South, and the door is open now for more minority registration to be able to vote, which is a big, big step. Okay. Then finally, you get the voting right, or I'm sorry, and I don't remember if I put it on here. You get the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which takes the Civil Rights Act of 1964 a step further. These are important, otherwise I wouldn't be telling you. Civil Rights Act of 1968 banned discrimination in the buying or renting of homes, office spaces, cars, things like that. So, effectively what we've seen happen in the 1960s through civil rights efforts have been to try to create a more equal and level playing field for blacks and whites in this country. In 1964, we banned discrimination in public facilities. In 1968, we say you can't discriminate against somebody if they want to buy a home, if they want to rent office space, if they want to rent a home, rent a car, or anything like that. If they have the financial means to be able to do it and the money to be able to do it, there should be nothing preventing them from doing that. So there you go. I think that's everything here. I know this one went a little bit long. I'll try to be shorter the next couple times, at least not this long. I mean, I know I usually go longer than I say, but this one was especially long. So anyway, that's all I got. We'll see you next time, all right?